This is really just a official warm welcome to the social poverty, the impact of connection. As I mentioned, we have an incredible speaker with us today. We're very excited to introduce it. Actually, if you bring me to the next slide, I will get on with the introduction. I actually wrote it down because it's so good. So we are so excited to introduce today Dr. Sarah Halpern Meakin, who's a professor in the School of Human Ecology. Oops, sorry. School of Human Ecology and in the La Follette School of Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She does research on family relationships and family finances and on the role of public policy in interviewing in those areas. Her current studies focus on churning, on-again, off-again relationships, on the perspectives of men who are out of the formal labor force, and on the experiences of mothers with young children receiving a monthly unconditional cash transfer. She has published books on the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is called It's Not Like I'm Poor, How Working Families Make Ends Meet in a Post-Welfare World, and on government-funded relationship education programs called Social Poverty, Low Income Parents, and the Struggle for Family and Community Ties. And with that, we want to say welcome, Dr. Sarah Halpern. We are so excited to have you. Can't wait for this discussion.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. And before I get started, I want to thank all the folks at Halpern for making this happen. And I also want to extend my thoughts to all of you. I've been reading the news and checking in with my colleagues in California, and I know the weather and reporting there has been very challenging and is continuing to be challenging. So I hope you all are doing okay. And thank you for being here, especially with all of that. So I'm going to talk to you today about some research I've done around the concept of what I call social poverty. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to introduce that idea by telling you about research that I did with a relationship education program in California. Sorry, you're in California, in Oklahoma. That's where the program is. And I'm going to do that by telling you some stories about some of the families and parents that I met while I was doing this work. So I'm going to tell you first about Ashley, who was 20, and Mark, who was 21 when I met them. They arrived hand in hand the first time I talked to them. Ashley was 7 months pregnant at that point. She was very engaged and dramatic while we talked. She used her hands a lot. She acted out moments as she was telling me about their lives. Mark, on the other hand, was very quiet. His eyes were quite bloodshot. He worked the graveyard shift at Kentucky Fried Chicken the night before, so he was pretty tired. They continued to hold hands, not just when they walked in, but throughout the hour or so that we talked. And they told me the story of their relationship. They said they'd been friends before their relationship had turned romantic. They moved in together after only a month, so they'd known each other for longer. And Ashley got pregnant pretty quickly thereafter. It was the first child for both of them. Ashley says that she feels more emotionally cared for by Mark than she has in previous relationships. And she said, I don't think of him as just a fiance. I think of him as a best friend, and he is. He's my best friend. If I didn't have him, I'd probably be the loneliest person on earth right now. So when it comes to social support, Ashley and Mark lean on each other pretty heavily. They told me that they distanced themselves from their former group of friends because there'd been a lot of conflict in that group. They even said that they maybe wanted to move to another state to escape what Mark described as all that high school drama. They had lived with Mark's mother, but they'd struggled to get along with her and Mark's siblings, so they now were living with Ashley's mom. That had been working well enough so far, but neither she nor they wanted that arrangement to last for very long. So they had these strained relationships with friends and family, but they were really trying to make sure they didn't enter parenthood alone. And so they enrolled in this relationship education program called Family Expectations that taught couple communication and parenting skills. And when I asked why they had decided to enroll, Mark told me at least be able to have some type of stability or be nearing stability by the time we're done. And I said, do you mean financial stability? I was imagining how a couple that's trying to get by on Mark's $1,000 a month in earnings would be sort of laser focused on dollars and cents. But Mark corrected me. He said, not the case of financial, because with the way kids are nowadays, we're not going to be financially stable for years now. And I know that. But just get to the case where we're not trying to rip each other's heads off, just families. So an engaged couple like Ashley and Mark, and working full time, isn't usually what we think of when we hear the term welfare. But due to a little known twist in the Sweeping Welfare Reform Act in 1996, some states now use their welfare dollars from the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program to fund programs that are sometimes referred to as marriage promotion, but which are known to program developers and staff as relationship education. And so that is the case for the program that Ashley and Mark were attending. The idea was to give them concrete skills that they could use to manage conflict in healthier ways. So there's a series of group workshops where couples are coming together, they're learning about fighting fair and communicating well. And so even though Ashley and Mark don't receive any assistance from the cash welfare program, welfare dollars were flowing their way nonetheless, paying for workshop leaders, the dinners they ate during workshop breaks. And so I argue that to understand these kinds of programs and the positive views that parents like Ashley and Mark have of them, we need to take seriously their relational needs and not just their financial needs. But financial needs are often what are the focus when we discuss these kinds and other kinds of programs. So when there's been news coverage of these sorts of programs, often the coverage has been critical, and critical in part because there's this connection that people are making between the programs focused on relationships and the programs being funded through a source that is intended to support the finances of people who might be living under the federal poverty line. And so you see these critiques here, such as from Rebecca Rosen in The Atlantic: marriage will not fix poverty. So the coverage has been, sort of nearly universally critical. And research findings in some ways haven't been all that much more positive. For example, if we look at large scale randomized control trials, which are sort of seen as the gold star standard of social science research and medical research, when we look at those trials from about a decade ago, they showed that there were either no significant impacts on relationship quality or stability, or initially improvements in happiness, distress, and communication, but that stability didn't, that couples were no more likely to be together about 2 years after participating in the program than couples who had not participated in the program. So we have folks in the media, we have these research findings sort of saying, this is not good, this is not great, we probably shouldn't be doing these programs. Yet that contrasted really strongly with what I heard from participants. So Robert was a first-time father when we met. He was 21. He said, it was like family expectations put a phrase or a word above the problem we had. It was like, this is your problem here. So now we knew how to take what steps we needed to take care of it. So that was definitely building us up stronger each week. I heard from Otis and Danelle. They were in their 30s, and they contrasted the atmosphere of the housing project where they lived with the atmosphere of family expectations. And Otis told me about their apartment complex where we were sitting when we talked. If we wasn't here, a lot of things would be a lot different. We could get out and laugh and do other things. When you're sitting here, you're stuck in this black cloud. Their housing project was sort of protected by being fenced in, but in some ways for a couple like Otis and Janelle who didn't have a car, it felt more like we were trapped as opposed to protected. Janelle compared this to their time at Family Expectations, and she said, with Family Expectations, you get peace of mind. You're around good, positive people, nothing negative, nothing. So in my research, I interviewed 62 younger adults who had enrolled in Family Expectations. I talked to them multiple times over the course of a year. The average income for the couples was around $1,500 a month. Very few had education beyond high school. None of the couples were married at the start of the program. And all either had just had or were about to have a shared child together. So participants quite liked the program, but the researchers and commentators were really critical of them. And so I was left struggling with this puzzle, like, how do I make sense of what I'm hearing on the ground when I talk to families and what I'm reading in the newspaper or in research journal articles or reports? How can I make sense of all of this? And so that's what I set out to try to do. So I looked at first what existing research tells us. And one of the things that I was seeing among some research studies is that particularly for families with more limited financial resources, researchers were noticing that people reported experiencing mistrust or a lack of durable or reliable relationships. And that even relatives or romantic partners or friends could even be viewed with distrust. The research, of course, doesn't point to these as flaws in individuals themselves. Rather, it recognizes that the social structures they're embedded in, like power hierarchies between low-wage workers and their employers, between public benefit claimants and caseworkers, all of those sorts of things shape the relationships that people have. So thinking about how an environment with limited resources and opportunities might shape the relationships that people have. Looking at relationships generally, though, among researchers, and often even in our public conversations, tends to focus on things like social capital. And social capital refers to those connections that you have that you can convert into economic resources. Like, do you know somebody who knows somebody who can help you get a job interview? Do you have somebody who can loan you some money if you're in a tight spot? Do you have somebody who will let you crash on their couch if you need a place to stay? So this previous research really tends to focus on sort of the use value of relationships. How can these social ties help you get other stuff that you need, like economic resources? But we know that people have real relational needs that are perhaps unmet. I wanted to explore that more. So I started to see how perhaps the answer to this puzzle of why parents were responding positively to this program, even as journalists and researchers were viewing them more negatively, might be because we needed to start taking really seriously what Ashley had said of Mark. If I didn't have him, I'd probably be the loneliest person on earth right now. A lot of times we take an economic perspective when we analyze or seek to understand what motivates people to participate in programs, to move in with somebody or get married, to stay in school versus dropping out. And I certainly do not deny the importance of financial resources. I, in fact, spend a lot of my other research time looking at people's experiences with financial resources. But I want to push us to think more about the relational resources that people have and how the desire to pursue or secure relational resources might be a key motivation for many people. So if we don't then account for the necessity of these relational resources to people, we might not be able to understand why people do what they do and how government policies and programs affect them. So I started using this term social poverty as a kind of linguistic counterbalance to this predominant focus on financial poverty. I view social poverty as lacking dependable friends or family members who provide emotional support and companionship, and to whom you can safely disclose your vulnerabilities. So do you have somebody where you feel like you can call them, tell them what you're really thinking and feeling, and you know they're going to need it? Different people have different levels of social needs. Some of us are fine with one or two close friends. Other people need a lot of folks in their lives to feel like their relational needs are going to be met. Also, I think it's really important to note that social poverty operates independently from financial poverty. So it may be the case that lacking resources in one area can increase the risk of experiencing the other kind of poverty, but they certainly don't go hand in hand. You have somebody with all the money in the world who might feel a sense of social poverty. So why does social poverty matter? It's far more than a matter of hurt than this research has been showing us. We've learned that social isolation and lacking emotional supports are tied to poor health behaviors, poor mental and physical health outcomes, and even an increased risk of mortality. You may be seeing stories in the news these days. There's a new book out by some Harvard researchers that followed folks for decades and decades and saw that their social connections were actually one of the things that were most predictive of their health outcomes and the happiness that they reported in life. The effect sizes here, which is something we look at in research to see how much something matters, are really quite substantial. We've seen that emotional supports during pregnancy, for example, are associated with a lower risk of postpartum depression and better birth outcomes for newborns. And I think, in short, just as with economic poverty, the effects of social poverty can really reverberate throughout families' lives that impacts the well-being of the next generation. We've seen from other research that social support facilitates better parenting, sort of that sensitive and responsive caregiving, and also promotes children's development. So what sets people up to be vulnerable to social poverty? Parents like Ashley and Mark are in the midst of a flurry of transitions that might disrupt their relationships with friends and family and challenge the creation of secure romantic relationships. So for many of the parents who I met, their pregnancies came pretty early on in the relationship before really firm commitments had been made. So they often really felt like they were still figuring out how to be partners to each other at the same time that they were figuring out how to be parents. A lot of the parents I met were quite young, in their early 20s, and so they were still engaged in the culturally appropriate explorations of that life stage. In our dominant culture in the United States, the idea is still that in your early 20s, you might be trying to figure out your identity independent from your parents, maybe still getting an education, trying to figure out what career path you're on, and working to gain some residential and financial independence. So those things are often still in flux for many people. But having all of those things in flux can really conflict with our cultural requirements for successful, responsible parenting and partnership, because we see those roles of partner and parent as things people do when they're settled and stable. We know from previous research that the periods in the life course when people are most prone to experiencing loneliness and social isolation are in old age, but also in early adulthood. And that's in part because so many things are in flux for young adults. So all of these transitions create this risk of social poverty. A lot of relationships need to be renegotiated as people change who they are and what they're doing. Their relationships with friends and family change. And it can be difficult to build trust in this environment, because in order to trust a partner, you have to believe that your interests and expectations are aligned with your partners, and that they're going to act with your interests and expectations in mind. And that might not be the case when so much of who you and they are is changing, and what you want and what you do is changing so rapidly. On top of all of this, many of the families I met were trying to get by on very limited resources and the stresses of possibly not being able to afford what you need for yourself, for your children, having an income that can stretch to cover all the bills and maybe a few wants as well. That can also weigh on individuals in a relationship. But as Mark told me, while these financial needs won't go away, he wanted to be able to weather them with Ashley without trying to rip each other's heads off. And so Ashley and Mark felt like they could get by without home service, but they didn't want to get by without one another. So financial poverty matters without a doubt. However, to assert that in the presence of financial poverty, no other issue can or should receive priority, I think fails to respect the wishes and needs of people who are getting by on limited economic resources. And I heard that from the parents throughout my study, that securing these social connections, these resources for themselves and the children was a primary concern. And for me, what that means is we really have to do any analysis of trying to understand society, understanding policies and program evaluations in recognition of those needs. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more now about parents' experiences and family expectations as a way of showing how social poverty comes into play in a programming or family service. I'm going to tell you about Tiana and Stefan. That's not the couple you're looking at. You're looking at a couple who did participate in family expectations, but it was not in my study. I protect the identities of all the people who participate in my research. Tiana and Stefan were in their early 20s. They'd been together for the past 4 years. They had broken up for about 5 months, a year or so before we met. Their relationship had really been under strain from Tiana's struggles as a teenager, from being bounced between her father's house, her grandmother's house, and a foster home. So now they said they're stronger than ever as a couple, and they were looking forward to having their first child, a little girl, who was due a few months after we first met. They lived with Stefan's parents, his brother and his grandmother, and they said they prefer to live on their own, but that arrangement did allow the two of them to make ends meet. They split their bills evenly between the two of them. She worked at a daycare center and he worked at a grocery store. They really prided themselves on being different from everyone else, from how they looked and dressed, to how they acted. They told me how they looked ahead and joked about their daughter being a teenager and them trying to embarrass her by enacting sword fights in the living room that her friends were around. So they really embraced this idea of sort of being different. And they found a really deep comfort in their shared differences. Tiana said of Stefan, "He's my lifeline. He talks me through everything. My personality completes his and vice versa. And a life without him," she said, "just doesn't make sense." So in her words, we can hear what an incredible social resource she has in Stefan. She feels really connected and understood and seen. And so it was deeply important to her to avoid social poverty by making their relationship last this time, especially as they were bringing a child into the world. Given her past, Tiana said, it was hard for her to trust that their relationship would go the distance. She feels like she's just seen too many people, parents to past boyfriends, walk out on her before and she with them. So as they looked ahead to making a family life for their daughter, not repeating the past was a really big motivator for the two of them. Tiana told me, "I think we pretty much have a moment every single day when we see his parents together or we talk about my parents and we're like, we're never going to do that, never." So part of their push for coming to family expectations was to do things differently than what they had seen from their own parents. And Stefan told me about what it was like when he walked into family expectations, when they came to tour the facility before they sent him back. He said he took one look around and he was sold. He remembered thinking to himself, you sit in comfy chairs and watch a presentation and they teach you? I'm cool. And excuse me, Tiana described her first reaction to seeing the facility as, can we move in? So they were clearly motivated to attend the program because of the family life they wanted for their daughter, but the program's well-appointed spaces and meals also made family expectations feel like the right place to be at. But the people really mattered too. Tiana said, it just seemed like we need things comfortable. I've taken parenting classes before for work, in her work job as a daycare worker. And you're like, man, I don't want to be here. But they made it feel really comfortable. When we first came in, they were showing us everything, and he was talking to us like he'd known us all of our lives. That last phrase, like he'd known us all of our lives, right? They felt connected and accepted immediately, welcomed, comfortable in this space when they first walked in. And that was really important to them, even though they sort of present themselves as being social outsiders and dress like they're outsiders. Being accepted and welcomed was incredibly important to them. When we first met, they had already attended a few of their workshop meetings, and Stefan was really enjoying himself. He said, it's real fun. It's able to get a couple out away from the hustle and bustle of life, away from their kids, even if their kids are just in the on-site childcare center. It gets them secluded so they feel safe and away from all the stresses, able to just let go. Even if it's just for an hour and a half, it's nice to just spend that time alone. Tiana didn't just want to escape stress. She hoped that family expectations would help them learn to cope with stress better too, especially because they were about to be parents. She said, something as small as a spilled glass of milk is like catastrophic to me when I'm stressed out. So learning how to deal with stress and put it to good use around the baby is what's important to me right now, because I'm not functional when I'm stressed out. So she was turning to family expectations for help with better management of stress, not only individually, but also with Stefan. And as I talked to parents like Tiana and Stefan to learn about what was leading them to come to this program in the first place, what I was hearing is that all of these sources of ambiguity in their lives were leaving them searching for a firmer foundation for their families as they look to the future. So couples saw family expectations as offering the possibility of helping to lay that firmer foundation. It resonated with parents. It felt welcoming. It felt positive. They participated pretty extensively in workshops. They benefited from some of the on-site little store where they could buy diapers or other baby items using some of the participation incentives that they received. But couples also felt like they gained an opportunity to build their relationship with each other, both from having that protected time, like Stefan talked about, but they also talked about how they were building relationships with other people through their interactions with staff and the other couples that were in their workshops. So they were building their internal social resources inside their couple relationship or inside their family. And they also felt like they were often building social resources through the connections they were making in the program. But as I had these first conversations, I wondered whether all those positive experiences and special time together would lead to real change in couples relationships. And so that's what I looked at as I followed them over. So we've seen really broader cultural changes, like our norms around romantic relationships changing, such that people don't always know what to expect from one another. Sometimes people don't know what the status of their relationship is. It can be hard to have those discussions about who you are to each other and what expectations you have for the future. And in addition, a lot of the couples, a lot of the parents who I had met said they didn't feel like they'd seen very well functioning relationships among the adults in their lives when they were growing up. And that left them feeling like they just weren't sure what they should do, what they should expect from one another. And having a lack of shared expectations can lead to conflict because partners' expectations for each other might not align. And their ability to interpret the meaning of one another's behavior can be weakened. And so having misaligned expectations or not being able to interpret what it means when your partner does something can erode trust and commitment. And that weakens a key social resource that people had, which was their relationship with one another. So I came back 3 months after couples had started this program to talk to them more about how things were going, to find out what their experiences were like. And one of the couples I talked to, Brianna, who was 18, and her boyfriend Zach, who was 20, were living with his mom and his brother. They were having their first child. When they had started family expectations, they got in arguments quite a bit. It was one of the reasons they wanted to go. Their arguments often ended with Brianna just sort of shutting down emotionally and refusing to talk, and Zach storming out of the house to go smoke and walk around and hang out with his best friend as a way of calming down. After their time in the workshops, they were still doing those same things, but they were labeling this as something different. So they had learned about timeouts in the workshop, that as a conflict was escalating, one of the things that you can do is take a timeout so that the conflict doesn't escalate further and that you don't end up doing or saying things that you regret later. And so now Brianna kind of getting quiet or Zach leaving the house isn't them kind of abandoning each other. It's now taking a timeout. And so the same behavior was labeled as something that they both viewed as positive or productive. Brianna said at family expectations, they said, when we get so angry, take a timeout. So I just let him walk away and calm down, and I give him a few minutes and then go talk to him, or he comes and talks to me. So family expectations didn't actually teach them to take timeouts. They've been doing it already. But the way they viewed it was negative, right? Zach was mad that Brianna would stop talking. Brianna was mad that Zach left the house. Now they were doing the same thing, but they didn't view it as destructive for their relationship. They viewed it as a positive way of putting a pause on conflict. So they now had a norm and a shared expectation for how to deal with conflict. Another way that the workshops seem to help couples establish shared expectations and relationship norms was by showing them in this group workshop setting that conflict and struggles were common and a part of every relationship. So this was a way of easing social poverty by offering a community of families who are going through similar transitions. And so the program provided a framework for people to better understand their relationships. Abby, who was 22, said, it was exciting to see a lot of other people going through the same things we were and, get feedback from them. Made me think, I never looked at it like that. So that was just neat. So these connections, right, of sharing an experience from people. So couples had told me that they wanted to participate in family expectations because they were often having relationship problems, particularly around communication. They weren't usually participating because their relationship was just perfect and they wanted it to be more perfect, but rather they wanted to address existing problems. And for most of the couples, the program really felt to them like a successful response to the needs that they brought in. They learned about more successful ways of managing conflict and ways of building their healthy communication skills. That made them feel like it was putting their relationships on a path that was moving in the right direction. So it certainly didn't solve all the problems they had, but it felt like they had some more tools now to begin to work on those issues, and that made them feel more hopeful about the future of their family lives. For some, learning the mechanics of a particular communication tool was useful, but for others, just having that opportunity to create those shared expectations was really meaningful. It helped set couples up to be just a little bit slower to get angry, a little bit quicker to let trivial matters go, a little more sure that this was the kind of relationship that they wanted to show their children. And so that helped them to think of their relationship as something that was an asset in their lives, a social resource rather than something that was dragging on them. So they felt like they were gaining tools that could help them protect themselves from social conflicts. So in sum, what I was seeing was that people saw family expectations building their relationships by offering assistance navigating transitions. So the staff would talk to them about how to make plans for the future, both for themselves as individuals and for as a couple, right? What couple goals did they have and how did they want to work on them? It helped establish shared expectations and norms so that it was easier to potentially trust one another because we knew how to interpret and understand what one another was doing. It helped to build a sense of shared commitment to the relationship because you could see that your partner was showing up every week to do this work. It helped to provide social supports within that program environment, those connections to staff and to other couples in the program. And it helped to give partners a feeling that they, their co-parent who they'd come in with could be a relational resource to them as they were tackling the exciting challenge of welcoming. As I was thinking about the particular context that many of you all work in, I was thinking about the research in sort of the social welfare and child well-being space, and really looking at how it tells us that social supports, either that people have individually or in their neighborhoods, are protected against risks to children. So in one study, some researchers found that nearly a third of the children who are involved in child protective investigations in Canada had parents that lacked adequate social supports. We also know from other research that children themselves have extensive social support needs as they navigate transitions and the experiences of. So these needs are very real and present. We also know from some research that Katie McGuire-Jack and her colleagues have done that living in a neighborhood with more trust and support among neighbors is associated with a lower likelihood of neglectful behaviors among mothers. And researchers also find that there are some of the increased risks that come from living in a neighborhood with higher poverty rates are mitigated when that neighborhood has a more trusting and supportive relationship among neighbors, at least when it comes to risks for child abuse. And so that really underlines how facets of life outside family dynamics and outside financial resources can shape child welfare risks. It points to the potential directions for investing in promoting positive child outcomes through broader community investments. So we can think of how we build neighborhood life as one way of protecting parents and children. Because in our society, for a number of reasons that may well make sense, child removal is stigmatized for the parents experiencing it. We need to think about how interactions with child welfare systems can shape or limit the social supports that parents have, particularly as they're already coping with multiple forms of disadvantage. And how, if you are more stigmatized and therefore more likely to be rejected by the people in your life, how that might shape your ability to comply with directives and achieve your communication. We know from other research that lacking adequate social supports increases the likelihood of reunification ending and repeated at-home placements. So again, this real sense, right, both in the prevention during any experiences with the child welfare system, and then as we're coming to that reunification stage, the success of that stage all is dependent not just on, but in part on the sorts of social resources that people have. And as I look at that, to me, it suggests that investing in building individual level and community level social resources can be useful in preventing child maltreatment and increasing the likelihood of children being successfully reunified. If that's our goal. When I step back from that and think more broadly about what the implications are of this work and thinking about policy, I want to make sure that we don't see addressing social poverty as a competing objective with easing income poverty. Addressing both, I think, makes really good sense. So relationship education, not a great way of addressing financial poverty. So those journalists who said this is not a fix for poverty, they were right, but that didn't mean the program was worthless. The people who participated in it found a lot of value because it helped them build another kind of key resource for them, their social resource that helped them avoid financial poverty. So previous research often has not analyzed programs and policies through the lens of social poverty. But we can still see evidence, I think, of success in addressing this need from other kinds of interventions. So I'm going to talk about two kinds of examples of approaches to policymaking that I think recognize this social poverty element. So first is to design programs to promote dignity. You'll recall how important it was to people to feel welcomed into a space, to be offered a drink when they walked through the door, to be given a meal if they were someplace during mealtime. Those things that we do for people when we're friends with them make people feel seen and understood and important and like they matter. And we can do that in a variety of ways. So just as two examples, research in the education field has shown that it's not just instrumental support that helps at-risk youth stay in school, but that instrumental support combined with emotional support. So having relationships with folks that you feel like they are secure with and that they trust can help the youth feel like they matter to somebody. And that actually increases the likelihood that they'll stay in school and not drop out. So we can have policies and programs that purposefully nurture those kinds of connections. As another example, I was fascinated to read about a Dutch nursing home that had started offering free housing to university students who volunteered to spend time with the residents. The purpose of the program was to address the social needs of the elderly. But I also look at that not just as addressing the financial needs of the young adults, but also similarly offering social connections and relationships for young adults in that setting. I think these really creative ways of supporting people across generations, especially to groups who are so vulnerable to social isolation, should really be something that we continue to develop ideas for in the future. A second way that, or a second sort of guiding idea that I take with me as I look at policies and programs is the importance of delivering social services in a way that builds relationships between program participants, between participants and staff, and between participants and important other people in their lives. A sociologist, Victor Chen, did this really fascinating study looking at the experiences of laid off auto workers in Detroit and just over the border in Canada. So they'd all experienced this devastating event of being laid off. But the workers in Detroit reported really feeling isolated in this experience. And that really contrasted with what Chen saw in Canada, where they had set up these action centers in response to this mass layoff and staffed those action centers with people who had also just lost their jobs as part of the layoff. So in addition to offering the laid off workers help in navigating benefit access or in training programs, the center also provided this physical space where people could find fellowship and emotional support during their struggles with unemployment. And that really shaped how they did sort of in terms of their mental health following this event. Similarly, sociologist Mario Small has uncovered how parents gain essential knowledge and other resources through the relationship that they develop with staff at childcare centers, but that those exchanges of information were more likely to occur when there were opportunities, informal opportunities like cookouts and things like that, that really facilitated the development of trusting relationships between parents and staff. So again, really attending to how we set up social services, not to just deliver resources, but also to deliver social ties. So we can continue to think about how we build these connections between people as they come through the doors with their peers, with staff, and also with the important other individuals who they have in their lives, because those strong ties can continue to support them even after they leave the program and support them over the long term. I'm going to leave it there. I really look forward to our discussion and to answering your questions. So I'm going to welcome you to put questions in the Q&A as opposed to in the chat. And I will take a look at what you're putting in there and address what you are interested in learning about. So our first question comes from Kay. Hi, Kay. You asked if I could talk about how social poverty might be important uniquely or not to intimate relationships versus other relationships. So I think about social poverty as a need that can be met through our intimate ties, but also through other ties as well. And so I don't think it is unique to intimate relationships. For some people, that is one of the ties that they desire, but for other people, it's not. And so I don't think we need to just focus or think that intimate partnerships are uniquely going to offer this connection. So it certainly can be, and for many people is, an important source of meeting their relational needs, but it doesn't have to uniquely be those. And then Kay asked about role theory specifically as it impacts expecting and parenting teens. So we know that being a teen parent is challenging. Being a parent at any point in time can be challenging, and perhaps has gotten more challenging in some ways in recent years because it has become less normative. We've seen an incredible decline in rates of teen pregnancy over the past 30 years or so. And so whereas it was once not uncommon for somebody to experience parenthood before the end of their teen years, it has now become pretty uncommon. And so our sense of what is normative for teens has changed over time. That can present an even bigger conflict between our conception of what we think of as the things teenagers do or the things that are normative in adolescence and the things we expect of parents. And so I think particularly for those young parents, we're likely to see a conflict in their roles that they have to navigate, which can be challenging as they try to maintain their relationships as their adolescent self and as their parenting self. Great questions. All right, next we have a question from Amy. Who asks, was your research directed by already established theory? Because Amy's trying to work on a dissertation. That's always exciting. So I was informed by
existing work, but I was not aware of any sort of theory of social poverty. There was work in psychology in particular on loneliness, and there was research in sociology on social capital, but I really wasn't seeing those things come together through the sociological lens that I use to look at things to better understand how social connections and the emotional meaning of those relationships really mattered to people. Amy further asks whether we could use social poverty to address the need for connections as we grapple with teaching history and addressing systemic racism. So I certainly hope that it's one of the tools that we can use as we ask those questions and we think of how inequities in opportunities and resources can really shape the kinds of relational needs that people have and the opportunities for filling the relational needs that people have. Good luck as you develop your dissertation also. Next, Julie says, oh, my Q&A just hopped down. Julie says, do you think the social connection can be informal and make an impact? Absolutely. I think there can be formality, right? There can be things that institutions do to increase the likelihood that those formal connections happen. That example that I was giving, what Mario Luis Small has seen in his work in Head Start centers and other childcare centers, that just having those opportunities, right, like a pizza night or something like that, where people are coming together and having the chance to chat, can be helpful in creating those relationships. And so it doesn't have to be that you're saying we are all going to sit down and connect. It can just be that we are setting things up to facilitate the likelihood of that happening. You can even think about how neighborhoods can be set up to make it more and less likely that you'll create social connections, right? Are there shared communal spaces? Are people walking versus driving? Do people go from a house into a garage, into a car where they're never going to see a neighbor or chat with somebody? And so we can think about how we set up spaces to have those informal and formal opportunities for connection. All right, next, Kelly asks, are there any programs you're aware of bringing single moms together? There certainly are, many support groups, both online and in person. But one program that comes to my mind is a program that a colleague, Galena Rhodes, runs in Denver that is for people who are pregnant and expecting, and brings them together in a setting to receive some connections with prenatal care, but also to have discussions around the relationships in their lives. Some of those pregnant people might be co-parenting, and some of them might be parenting on their own. So there certainly are programs where we can start thinking about supporting people in their parenting role and supporting their creation of connections with other people, whether or not they're romantically involved with anybody, even before a child arrives. And so people do that sort of informally online, but we also see some programs developing to do that in person. That program, again, is called Motherwise, and it's in Denver, run by Galena Rhodes. Ruby says, I read about social poverty in What Happened to You by Bruce Perry and Oprah. I am not aware of Bruce Perry and Oprah's work called What Happened to You. I'm guessing from your question that it's relevant to trauma-informed care. And so that aspect certainly came up quite a bit in the conversations I was having with parents, especially as they were thinking about how to use the tools that they were learning in the program. Some parents were saying things like, I know I should take a timeout, but I just get so angry and I go from 0 to 60 so fast. It's like I don't have a chance to press the brake pedal on my emotions. And that's something that we know is more likely to happen for people who have experienced trauma. And so one of the suggestions I had to program developers as they were coming out of this was that they think more about that trauma-informed approach, and how some of the tools that might work for some individuals may not work as well for other people who had experienced trauma. But that trauma-informed approach is also really important to the program staff, who are really mindful of the experiences that the families are bringing into their program, and do their work with that in mind. So that helps them to develop those relationships where people are feeling seen and accepted, even if they might have strained relationships with others outside of the program, even with their own family. Next, let's see, Samantha asks, could you please review what drives social poverty within a community? So I don't know that we have great measures of what I term social poverty in a community, or that we've even really developed a concept of how we'd measure that, because one of the things that we know is that social poverty is an individual experience and an individual need. But I really like where you're going with this question, which is saying we can think about how social needs cluster together geographically. And this connects with what I was talking about before with like neighborhood connection, right? That we can have these characteristics of neighborhoods. Do you feel like you know your neighbors, you trust your neighbors? And we can think about how those characteristics of neighborhoods are going to set people up to be more and less likely to experience social poverty. Because if you don't know or don't trust your neighbors, you're certainly not in a good position to start building social connections with them or to meet your social needs through those relationships. So the characteristics of neighborhoods that I would look to include that social environment, right? Do you feel like you can trust and know your neighbors? That's going to come in part from things like, do people live in the neighborhood for very long, or do you see high rates of turnover? It's also going to come from the physical setup of a neighborhood. You know, as I talked about before, are there communal spaces where people can gather? Is it a walking environment versus a driving environment? Because that affects your likelihood of running into folks and being able to have a conversation. And it also has to do with how safe your neighborhood feels. Do you feel like you're at risk if you take your kids out to play in the yard or to go to the park down the street? And so the sorts of community investments in shaping the safety, walkability, and opportunities for communal connection really make a difference, I would suspect, in the likelihood of a neighborhood either facilitating or inhibiting the development of social resources for individuals living in that space. Next, let's see. Edith asks, has there been research into the impact of social poverty in parents and extended family raising a child with developmental disabilities? That's a really great question. I don't know of research specifically on that. I do know of research, for example, by one of my colleagues here at the University of Wisconsin, who's named Segan Hartley, who does research on the relationship experiences of parents who are raising children with developmental disabilities. And one of the things that Dr. Hartley sees in her research is that parents can sometimes face some additional strains in their relationships because of sometimes the challenges of doing that parenting work, but we can also think about the parenting demands and potentially a lack of shared expectations between parents over who's going to do what, and the kind of social service and social environment that parents are doing that work in. So what kind of resources do they have available to them to help meet their child's needs and to help support them as they parent their child? And what kind of social connections do they have to do that? Do people back off from them because they don't really know what to say or how to support them? Or do people step forward and continue to be those social resources for them? And so, I think we've seen a real development in the research world of not just thinking about, how does a child with a developmental disability grow up? What are their outcomes? To thinking about how those outcomes and that developmental trajectory are situated within a family, but continuing to think about how that family is situated within a set of not just financial resources, but social resources as well, that's going to shape their experiences of how much stress and strain that comes with the joys and challenges of raising any child, including a child with a developmental disability. Really interesting. All right, next, Rose says, what are your thoughts on transitional aged youth, former foster youth, and social poverty? So this is actually something I've thought about quite a bit, because one of my former PhD students was working on her dissertation, looking at the experiences of former foster youth while I was doing this research. And so those two topics were really in my head as I was working. And one of the things that I was noticing was how often it was, right, that we have systems that are set up to not facilitate long-term relationships for transitional aged youth, right? So in some states, even, kids age out of foster care at 18. And in our culture today, that is not really the age at which most young people become full-fledged adults. Most are often still dependent in many ways on the older adults in their lives, their parents or caregivers. And we have a foster system in many states that doesn't recognize that. We've certainly, as I'm sure many of you know, seen change in that in some states, pushing the age at which youth age out to later ages. But even still, right, we're not setting people up to necessarily have those long-term family relationships that are going to carry them into the future. And so thinking about the challenges of providing sort of trusting long-term connections is really important. When we think about interventions for transitional age youth, we need to recognize, as one of you brought up before, the role of trauma in shaping the ability of people to connect and to trust people in their lives, and then how we set up institutions to sort of facilitate those ongoing connections over time. That are going to support youth while they're in the foster system and support them through the transition out of and then being out long-term of the foster system. So I think there's an awful lot there to really think about, because that is a system that does seem to put people particularly at risk for experiencing social poverty because of how it often buffets relationships. Next, Samantha says, what are creative ways to reach out to communities that have low levels of engagement and motivation to connect? Where's a good place to start? That is a fantastic and difficult question. I think probably the answer is that I can't tell you, which is that it's going to be different for different communities, because the reasons that one community or group of people might have lower engagement or motivation can be different for from group to group or from individual to individual. So in some cases, there might be linguistic barriers to engagement or motivation to connect. There might be cultural mismatch between between socializing opportunities and programs or policies. There might be mistrust that's either well-earned mistrust from an organization or a policy arm, or it might be mistrust that comes from a history of experiences that have shown that people don't show up for you or people don't return your calls or things like that. So I think, the place to start is to ask those questions, right? Why might people not be engaged? Why might people be not motivated to connect? And then also, I really encourage organizations to examine sort of micro level practices How long does it take you to call somebody back when they call? How often does it happen that an email or a phone call sort of falls through the cracks? Those things can sometimes seem small, and they are never really the policy outcomes that we look at when we're doing evaluation, but they're what people experience, and they're what say to people whether or not they matter to the program, whether or not the staff care about them or just see them as somebody else they have to deal with. And so thinking about all those micro level things, right? How long does it take for that phone call to get returned? What happens when somebody walks in a building? Are they greeted in a friendly way? Are they offered water on a hot day? Those all make a statement about how important somebody is to an organization, how much it matters to you that they're there. What happens if they don't show up for an appointment? Do they get a follow-up phone call that checks in to see if they're okay, or that tells them they're now going to face potentially some consequence for missing an appointment? Thinking about all of those micro level practices and the extent to which they make a statement about an interest in building connection or not, I think is a place where I would start my thinking. We now have 2 great comments from Kay Reed here, who's talking about a couple of programs, making suggestions that folks might be able to learn from. So Kay says, I've seen counselors at California community colleges use relationship skills programs with their CalWorks clients to help stabilize families and promote successful completion. And also we see transitional age youth involved in relationship education programs through programs like Independent Living and Youth Build. All youth, including LGBTQ+ youth, participate in such programs, and we've seen them learn skills to build stability in their lives and fulfill their own goals for intimate and family lives. Thanks for those suggestions, Kay. I don't know if the Caltrin folks have any other questions that they saw come through in the chat that they wanted to make sure we got a chance to talk about.
You know, we didn't see any additional questions. Thank you to the participants and the attendees that joined and dropped those questions into the Q&A feature. That really helped out. And thank you so much. We are so grateful just for your expertise and your extra time to answer questions and to provide this information today. I want to remind everyone on the call that there is a survey and certificate available. We'll drop it into the chat again so that you can see that. And you will receive a 2-day follow-up email in the next 2 days. So with that, we want to say thank you all so much for being with us, and we'll see you again. Thank you all.
Take care.